perspectives on international and national affairs. As many of you know, the Washington History Seminar is a joint product of the American Historical Association's National History Center on the one hand, and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and its History and Public Policy program on the other. My name is Eric Arneson. I am from George Washington University, and co-chairing with me this afternoon is Christian Osterman of the Wilson Center. A few formalities before we begin. If you have one of these devices, and I suspect everyone in the room does, you might take it out, check it, and make sure it's turned to the silent mode. These things tend to ring at the most inappropriate times, and we'd appreciate it if they didn't. Would also like to thank those who make this seminar possible. The ground operation is carried out by Amanda Perry of the National History Center and Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center. These are the folks who work very hard behind the scenes to make sure that the seminar comes off week after week without a glitch. We are also able to do what we do because of the support, the financial support of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, Schaefer, the George Washington History Department, and anonymous donors, some of whom might even be in this room, whose ranks would be, we would welcome you to join should you so desire. Next week, our seminar will feature Michael Kazin of Georgetown University speaking about his new book, War Against War, The Rise, Defeat, and Legacy of the Peace Movement in America, 1914 to 1918, and we meet every Monday afternoon at 4 p.m. And with that, I will ask Christian Osterman to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Eric. Welcome, everyone, from me as well. On behalf of the Wilson Center, delighted to have some new faces in the room, as well as some very familiar ones. So wonderful to have you all here. We have, I think, a particular treat today. One of this country's leading scholar, Professor Jenna Weissman Joselit, who is the Charles E. Smith Professor of Judaic Studies and Professor of History at the George Washington University, where she also created and now directs 2 graduate programs in Jewish culture and the arts, the first of their kind in this country. The author, among other things, of Wonders of America, which received the National Jewish Book Award in History, and of the critically acclaimed A Perfect Fit, Clothes, Character, and the Promise of America. Professor Joselit was a monthly columnist for the Forward newspaper for over 16 years, as well as a frequent contributor to the New Republic. She is now a columnist for the Tablet magazine. Her latest book, Set in Stone, America's Embrace of the Ten Commandments, the subject of her talk today, will be published next month by the Trade Division of Oxford University Press. A former senior fellow at Princeton University Center for the Study of Religion, on whose academic advisory board she still sits, Professor Joselit has also been a fellow at Michigan's Frankel Institute, Penn Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, and Yale Center for American Art and Material Culture. Most recently, she's been a distinguished visiting scholar at the Library of Congress's John Kluge Center. A warm welcome to you. We're looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Sitting down to a hearty breakfast and a spread of newspapers on a fine Monday morning in May 1908, Mr. and Mrs. Smith were surprised to learn that Charles Henry Parkhurst, one of New York's leading religious personalities, as well as a longtime crusader against urban vice, that Parkhurst had suggested from the pulpit of the Madison Square Presbyterian Church that it was high time to dispense with the Ten Commandments. I suppose the Decalogue was given in order that it might demonstrate its own futility, the Reverend glumly informed his parishioners in his Sunday sermon, adding, it had not succeeded millennia ago and was not held in any excess of respect even today. There is no point, he said, in hanging on to the ancient biblical covenant. It simply didn't work. Goodbye to the Decalogue, said he. Parkhurst's dispatch of the Decalogue set tongues wagging. What on earth could the man have been thinking? Had the cleric, whose many fans once likened him to the Chrysostom of Madison Avenue, thanks to his unstinting efforts on behalf of civic reform, had he thrown in the towel and given up on his fellow man? Had the author of The Sunny Side of Christianity fallen into a blue funk? Or could he be toying with everyone, his remarks a publicity stunt designed to train a spotlight on the Ten Commandments? For all the speculation, Parkhurst's motivations remained unclear. If his desired intention was to stir the waters, he succeeded. For a few days in May, the Ten Commandments were the talk of the town. They're the subject of my talk, too, as I explore the ways in which earlier generations of Americans kept them in active circulation, insisting that the United States had no civilization, no form, no character, and no distinctiveness without them. A broad swath of the population made sure the ancient biblical code was close at hand, its presence vital to, even an anchor of its national identity. In celebration of the Ten Commandments, some Americans suggested that a national holiday, or what they called a common commemoration, be held in their honor. Others went further still, proposing that citizenship be contingent upon familiarity with each one of the ancient do's and don'ts. This is not a religious test by any means, clarified Alabama Senator John Tyler Morgan, its proponent in 1897. It's a test that goes to the constitution of society. From where Morgan and other like-minded Americans sat, the 10 divinely inspired regulations were to the modern-day citizen what the Bible had been to their colonial forebears, but better, a moral shorthand, a crystallization of scriptural precepts, and the wellspring of civic order. By the late 19th century, the Ten Commandments had come to be an expansive American phenomenon rather than a strictly denominational one. How and why that came to pass is the subject of my forthcoming book, Set in Stone, America's Embrace of the Ten Commandments. Its narrative chronicles how Americans imagined the do's and don'ts into being, positioned them above and below the earth's surface, translated them into the vernacular, rendered them common ground, and pressed them into service as a hallmark of the nation's identity. Today's presentation offers just a sneak peek, zeroing in on one little aspect of America's fascination with the Ten Commandments, their translation from Holy Writ to household wisdom. Parkhurst's pronouncement may have come as a shock, but it was hardly the first time the Ten Commandments had been taken down a peg or two, their timelessness, much less their utility, questioned. As early as 1869, just a few short years after the Civil War, young America, we are told, had come up with a new trinity: money, fashion, and pleasure. Under its impress, the Ten Commandments were increasingly seen as a piece of old fogyism. The members of another late 19th century group, calling themselves very satisfied modern Americans, also pronounced the Ten Commandments old hat, or in their language, unevoluted. What do we know or care of them, especially the outdated seventh commandment, said one of their number, referring to the interdiction against adultery. Said another, even more categorically, the Ten Commandments are as inadequate a moral code today as camels are for transportation. It wasn't only the young or the self-satisfied who led the charge. Scholars of the ancient Near East, where camels held sway, also cast a searching eye on the timelessness of the ancient biblical code. Well, some of their number believed that the spade confirmed rather than dislodged the Bible, and that it was only a matter of time before the ground actually yielded up the Ten Commandments. A growing number of biblical critics and archaeologists had their doubts. A spate of arresting discoveries, both artifactual and textual, had thrown cold water on the historicity of Moses, and most especially on the ongoing relevance of his prescriptions. The Ten Commandments were never meant to serve as a foundational document for all of mankind, let alone for the citizens of the United States, the members of this community argued. The biblical covenant was a product of the ancient Near East, of a particular place and time, as well as a specific set of circumstances. A universal text, it wasn't. Ardent believers in positivism, some American biblical critics, those so-called perniciously advanced students of Wellhausen, even dismissed the idea that Moses, with the twin tablets in tow, had made it down the mountain in the first place. Two ancient stelae, fashioned out of stone and containing approximately 172 chiseled words, would surely have been much too heavy for the aging Moses to bear, said they. Social scientists, meanwhile, were more inclined to tinker, or in their words, readjust the Ten Commandments, than to jettison them. Thomas Carver, a Harvard University professor of economics, was among those doing a bit of readjusting. In lieu of casting the Ten Commandments into the dustbin of history, he proposed to contemporize them. America would be well substituted, said he, were it to substitute "thou shalt not drink," a much more pressing and timely commandment, for thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, an increasingly obsolete one. In early 20th century America, he suggested, the use of God's name in daily speech had become commonplace rather than sacrilegious. Instead of conceiving of blasphemy as a religious infraction, it was best to chalk it up to a dwarfed vocabulary or a lapse in manners. Drinking, though, was something else again, a real threat to society's stability. How about, then, a new commandment mandating temperance? Another academic, E.A. Ross, a professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin, went his Harvard colleague one better, arguing that Americans should not substitute one commandment for another so much as enlarge the Ten Commandments as a whole. Why not add an annual supplement of the latest vices that needed to be contained, he recommended. Picking up the gauntlet thrown down by their critics and tinkerers, others rose to the defense of the Ten Commandments, turning to nature rather than history or sociology to shore them up. Ernest Thompson Seton, the popular naturalist, author of Wild Animals I Have Known, was among the Decalogue's biggest fans. Spending time in the wild, amid the company of wolves, bears, rattlesnakes, and hawks, Seton tells of having subjected the rules of Moses to fresh, up-to-date examination. There he discovered that the laws of the animal kingdom bore an unusually close resemblance to those brought down from Mount Sinai, especially the last 6 of them. The Ten Commandments are not arbitrary laws given to man, but are fundamental laws of all highly developed animals, the scientists declared conclusively. In the Natural History of the Ten Commandments, an article that first appeared in the November 1907 issue of the high-toned and much-read Century magazine, and subsequently in the form of a slender book published by Scribner's. In its pages, Seton detailed how animals instinctively understood the importance of parental obedience, honored property rights, took great pains to avoid murdering their own kind, eschewed promiscuity, and practiced monogamy, which he observed was the rule among all the highest and most successful animals. By naturalizing the Decalogue, the scientist rendered its provisions an organic part of the universe, rather than an artifact of history. His conclusions came as welcome news to those given to fretting about the future of the ancient code. The commandments are safe, the New York Times reported with considerable relief, noting that Seton's words made for good reading and were admirably reassuring to boot. Although it took a naturalist to quiet the nation's doubting Thomases, or at least those who read the Times, the Ten Commandments were never in imminent danger of crumbling. Taken on their own, these discussions about naturalizing, historicizing, and contemporizing the covenant didn't amount to much. In the face of criticism here and skepticism there, the Ten Commandments held fast. Still, when these slings and arrows are bundled together, viewed cumulatively and over the long haul, one can see how bit by bit they did have an impact, a chipping away of the commandments' moral suasion, a weakening of their hold on the American body politic. By the early years of the 20th century, the Ten Commandments were no longer quite as high and mighty, as invincible, as they had once been. More and more Americans were prepared to entertain the possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, the Ten Commandments were not the ultimate arbiter of America's moral order. At the same time, though, few Americans were prepared to dispense with them altogether. How could they? The centrality of the Ten Commandments had been drummed into them since childhood, or at least since they were old enough to have attended Sunday school, where they made their way through instructional catechisms. Belief in the Decalogue was not easily surrendered. How then to engage with the biblical commandments, to reckon with their contingency, while also acknowledging their hold on the American imagination? How to balance their staying power with their malleability? It took some doing, but modern America eventually came up with the perfect solution. It redefined the Ten Commandments as a series of gentle cautions and helpful hints. Brought down from on high and thrust into the center of daily life, where compliance was now encouraged rather than mandated, the Ten Commandments were increasingly harnessed to quotidian matters, to piano playing and skincare, driving a car, finding true love, and being a good citizen. Nothing if not pliable, they lent themselves to new and decidedly modern applications. Extending their reach, the Ten Commandments became more boon companion than moral code, a shorthand for the right way of doing things. Less an assertion of divine will than the voice of authority or of a form of expertise, and a democratic one at that. The Ten Commandments secularized well. Unsure of how to grow tomatoes? All you had to do was to consult the Ten Commandments of pomology. Affairs of the heart got you down. The soothing harmonies of the Ten Commandments of love could lift your spirits. Determined to fight communism, the Ten Commandments of citizenship, commandment number 10, be Americans first, was the most willing ally. Cultivating interfaith relations high on your civic agenda, the Ten Commandments of goodwill, courtesy of the National Conference of Jews and Christians, furnished a helpful template. Urban life much too noisy? Why not arm yourself with the Ten Commandments of quiet automobile driving, whose tenets advocated thinking more and tooting less? Not sure how to maintain a lovely complexion? Helena Rubinstein's compendium of helpful hints, the Ten Commandments to Beauty, was at hand. Adolescent angst standing in the way of happiness, Paul Anka's The Teen Commandments just might brighten your day. Commandment number 9, avoid following the crowd, be an engine, not a caboose. Commandment number 10, keep the original 10 commandments. Let's take a listen.
Your parents down. They brought you up.
Number 3, be humble enough to obey. You will be given orders yourself someday. At the first moment, turn away from unclean thinking. At the first moment.
5, don't show off driving. If you want to race, go to Indianapolis.
Number 6, choose a date who would make a good mate.
7, go to church faithfully. The Creator gives you the week, give Him back an hour.
8, choose your companions carefully. You are what they are.
Number 9, avoid following the crowd. Be an engine, not a caboose.
10, or even better, keep the original 10 Commandments.
How's that? So whatever demons of daily life awaited the average American teenager and her parents, the 10 Commandments were at the ready, smoothing the way forward. Applying an age-old religious text such as the Bible to contemporary phenomena was, of course, nothing new. You could easily fill a bookshelf or two with the lights of the Bible of life insurance and the Bible of the blues, whose titles offered the promise of comprehensiveness, much less the patina of authority. But the 10 Commandments offered even more, their structure, language, and sensibility particularly suited to the modern age. Pithy and direct, aphoristic and handy-dandy, the text was of a piece with the snappy advertising copy of the marketplace and the memorable stay-in-your-head jingles increasingly heard on the radio. In 20th century America, everyone at some point or another had heard of the 10 Commandments. If nothing else, they were easily recognizable. That the authority of the Decalogue also derived from numbers furthered their appeal. There was something unassailable, something unmistakably modern about a system whose foundation rested on counting from 1 to 10. Their neat and tidy formulaity rang true, appearing to leave little margin for error. At the same time, any resemblance between the original and its offspring represented more of a symbolic convergence than a literal one. At no point did any of the modern-day applications of the 10 Commandments directly correspond to the original lineup. The 2nd, 6th, and 10th Commandments of good citizenship or skin care did not in any way align with the 2nd, 6th, and 10 Commandments of the version Moses brought down from Mount Sinai, either the first or the second time around. What inspired latter-day Americans to make use of the 10 Commandments for their own earthly ends was the prospect of clarity and the promise of order that a numerical composition like this one afforded. Taking the sting out of modern life, the 10 Commandments imposed a structure on its unpredictability and messiness. Authority, clarity, order, the perquisites of stability and of personal fulfillment. Is it any wonder that in our own day, the 10 Commandments have become a vehicle of self-help, a therapeutic document rather than an expression of transcendence? To leap from Mount Sinai to the analyst's couch does not seem to have been too much of a stretch. Not if we take the word of radio commentator Laura Schlesinger and educator David Hazony. As Schlesinger's 1998 bestseller, The 10 Commandments, The Significance of God's Laws in Everyday Life, and Hazony's well-received 2010 book, The 10 Commandments, How Our Most Ancient Moral Text Can Renew Modern Life. As these two texts suggest, the biblical sayings might well be the perfect antidote for what ails us. The 10 Commandments seem like an excellent formula for making one a much better person, Schlesinger declared, adding that they serve as a moral focal point for thousands of real-life issues, including God, family, our fellows, sex, work, charity, property, speech, and thought. Chatty and affable in tone, Schlesinger drew on a range of sources, from biblical texts to the on-air comments and letters composed by Americans named Becky, Cindy, Murray, and Paul, to show how and why the 10 Commandments remained relevant to modern-day America, and good for us, too. Each commandment in her book offered a contemporary life lesson, an opportunity to take stock and to do better, punctuated by familiar catchphrases on the order of, "Have you hugged your kids today?" "Adultery, just say no," and "time out." Schlesinger's account popularized the Ten Commandments, setting them squarely within the grooves of daily life, where Becky, Cindy, Murray, and Paul were encouraged to dust them off and to use them, as she put it, as a blueprint of God's expectations upon us and his plan for a meaningful, just, loving, and lovely life. Hazony, too, insisted on their relevance. Far more eloquent and learned than Schlesinger, he was just as determined as she to turn the Ten Commandments from what he called an abstract vision into something concrete and pragmatic. Chapter by chapter, commandment by commandment, the Jerusalem-based critics suggested how each one might figure as a biblical affirmation of the self, aka the fourth commandment, and as a revelation about ourselves, aka the first commandment. Notionally, about the Decalogue, Hazony's account placed the individual at the center of his narrative, inviting him or her to view the Ten Commandments as a template of personal uplift, a measure of confidence building. Every commandment, he exuberantly affirmed, every commandment represents a whole world of value, an awakening of the redemptive spirit in its own arena of life. As the Ten Commandments steadily came into their own as redemptive spirits and autonomous agents, so too did the tangible, visible forms in which they appeared. No longer the sole preserve of the church, the synagogue, and the Sunday school, where they were statically and somberly featured in a sanctuary and a classroom. Representations of the Ten Commandments grew more commonplace and livelier, more colloquial, less august. Shorn of their exclusively religious connotations, they blossomed into appurtenances of the everyday. Bookmarks, book covers, comic books, good conduct cards, postcards, and lavishly illustrated chromolithographs hung just so in a parlor or a bedroom. Today, many of these items can be found in archives and museums, where their artful blend of form and function, of tradition and modernity, catches the eye. Rooting around in the holdings of the National Museum of American History, I happened one day upon a late 19th century bookmark fashioned out of celluloid, or what we know today as plastic. On a narrow strip of the most up-to-date material of its time, the age-old biblical text looms large. It takes up much of the surface space. At the top or crown of this bookmark sits a flower, a rose in full bloom, looking as if it's ready to be plucked. It beckons, lush and inviting, and a tad mysterious too, for it's not at all clear how this floralized Ten Commandments was meant to be read. Those among us familiar with the language of flowers and its Christological associations might be inclined to see this particular rose as an expression of faith, as an example of what Lee Schmidt calls floral piety, a visual practice and language that spoke of rebirth and redemption. They'd be right to think so. This bookmark, after all, was of a piece with the steady incorporation of flowers into the late 19th and early 20th century celebration of Christian holidays, where they adorned greeting cards, advertisements, home decor, and most especially church interiors at Easter. The anonymous creator of the floralized Ten Commandments bookmark went a step further, beautifying the ancient legal code and situating it within a domestic context. The more contemporary-minded would also be right in thinking there is room here for another more free-floating reading, one that endows the flower with personal rather than religious meaning. The floral image of a rose atop the Ten Commandments hits at growth rather than stasis, at possibility rather than punishment. It domesticates the Ten Commandments, placing them well within reach. I'm also drawn to another floralized version of the Decalogue, a poster designed to be hung on a wall rather than a piece of plastic tucked inside a book. It, too, was a state-of-the-art affair, a testament to the visual power of chromolithography, awash in color, in saturated pinks and vibrant greens. It planted the Ten Commandments in a garden of flowers and branches. To gild the lily, cameos of ordinary people, some in ancient garb, others in modern dress, accompany each commandment to illustrate its meaning. There's a lot to take in, but then that's the point. This busy composition, rich in human incident and vibrant detail, was at once an opportunity for storytelling and an exercise in visual expression. Like the floral bookmark, this image brought the Ten Commandments down to earth, where they are softened, even feminized. The impact of its portrayal is felt even more keenly when you consider what is missing. A rock-ribbed Mount Sinai or a hardened Moses is nowhere to be seen. Even the presence of the stone tablets was muted. At one with their surroundings, they blend in rather than stand out. By stripping the Ten Commandments of their harsh, stony, patriarchal qualities and replacing them with a string of warm and familial associations, this particular chromolithograph suggests that the Ten Commandments had more to do with affirmation than with accountability. They're full of promise. The taming of the Ten Commandments similarly affected the ways in which Americans related to Moses, their standard bearer. Likened over time to a Greek god, but much improved, to the nation's favorite foundling, to a voodoo priest, to a kind of American Hamlet, as well as to one of the greatest salesmen who ever lived, as the Metropolitan Casualty Life Insurance pamphlet, Moses, Persuader of Men, blithely would have it. The biblical hero was increasingly transformed from a distant figure on a mountaintop into an inaccessible and all too human character of great and abiding appeal, especially to children, who more often than not now encountered him within the pages of a comic book or held him in their hands. Where the traditional view of Moses regarded him as seasoned and stern with discipline his stock in trade, the Moses befriended by American kids of the 20th century was plucky and resolute. Adventure was his calling card. Take Moses and the Ten Commandments, a Dell Comics publication, for example. Drawing on the gee whiz exclamation-ridden cadences of the genre, as well as its customary visual properties, it not only sets Moses within the company of other superheroes, but also translates his story into a modern coming-of-age drama. The plot, which takes its cue and contours from the biblical story with a gentle nod in the direction of Cecil B. DeMille's 1956 film, had largely to do with Moses' varied exploits. These anchor and shape the narrative as it moves at a fast clip from the stages of boyhood and adolescence into that of so-called confident manhood. A boyish Moses cannot keep his shirt or tunic in his pants. He drinks lots of milk. He asks too many questions, especially those having to do with Mother Nature, and he gets into and out of numerous scrapes with various and sundry authority figures. Quick-witted, he's equally quick with his fists and knows how to land a finely tuned punch. Most tellingly, Moses is quite comely. Shown to an advantage in a loincloth of all things, his body is finely chiseled and muscular, his eyes are blue and piercing, and his hair full and inky black. Even when his brow begins to furrow and he takes to wearing yards of striped fabric, a mark not only of his getting on in years, but also of his increasing seriousness, his body retains its youthful build. In the course of things, this Moses stares down a mighty lion, rights society's wrongs, acquires a new identity as an Israelite, squares off against a nasty Pharaoh, sees his people to safety, and, as an added bonus, receives the Ten Commandments. It's hard to keep up with him. By all accounts, he leads a full and action-packed existence, a wow of a life. Moses, the action figure, picks up where the comic leaves off. It, too, makes much of adventure. The story of Moses has more action than a James Bond movie, trills one website that features the doll. Miracles, murder, plagues, escape, betrayal. His life was filled with dramatic events and exciting adventures. Another website, sounding just like a comic book, down to its excessive use of exclamation points, gushes, Moses hooked us up with the Ten Commandments. He delivered the Jews from slavery. He parted the Red Sea. He lived to be 120. What can't he do? You, too, can feel the power. This paragon of possibility stands a commanding 5 1/4 inches tall and can articulate his joints in at least 16 different directions. His flexible musculature, we are told, empowers, and I quote now, to hang with your Spider-Man, Batman, and Superman. Though he is in good company, Moses differs from his compatriots in the manner of his dress. Where they consistently sport capes and tights, Moses' action figures vary their attire and accoutrement, as the toy industry rather grandly puts it. Some prototypes feature a world-weary, heavily bearded Moses clad in a flowing robe and sturdy sandals. At other moments, he represents a souped-up Roman gladiator, or Charlton Heston. Often, Moses stands alone and unencumbered. He can also be found wielding a staff, a set of the Ten Commandments, and other so-called authentic archaeological objects. On occasion, he even lugs around a portable burning bush or comes equipped with biblically based biographical information, conferring on him a wee touch of authenticity. Whatever its pedigree, the Moses action figure was intended as a peaceable alternative to the gun-toting, kick-in-the-groin antics of his counterparts. It was also intended to insinuate religion into the rhythms of daily life by providing Bible storytelling possibilities alongside moments of playtime fun. With the Moses action figure, prospective consumers were told you can recreate the entire epic saga of the Exodus in the comfort of your own home. Besides, if you happen to be Jewish, there is no better way to maximize the appeal of and to enhance the Passover Seder than by adding a Moses action figure to the guest list. This pint-sized hero can bring a miraculous new level of excitement to your Seder, advertisements posted with a straight face, holding out the possibility that fun and games with Moshe might banish the inevitable ritual ennui. I don't know about that. Seems a lot to ask of a doll. What I do know, though, is that Moses' action figures humanize the ancient biblical hero, placing him squarely within the warp and woof of the everyday, where he came into his own as a buddy, as someone fun to have around the house. From cutting Moses down to size and floralizing the Ten Commandments to rendering them an instrument of daily life, their history in modern America might well be seen as a woeful tale of diminution, perhaps even of desacralization and corruption. To conjure up an image of Moses high-fiving his compatriots or dispensing advice about skincare is arguably not a pretty picture. Surely you think to yourself, this was not what the biblical figure or the good Lord intended when the Ten Commandments first saw the light of day. Paradoxically enough, however, the vernacular embrace of the divine commandments represented an expansion rather than a delimiting of their circumference. By the mid-20th century, no arena of modern life was without a Ten Commandments of its own, lodged within every nook and cranny of American culture, rendered into language that everyone understood and applied to ordinary circumstances rather than heroic measures. The Ten Commandments in modern America had metamorphosed into this country's favorite to-do list. Thank you.
All right, and now we turn to our question discussion period. We have a couple of basic ground rules. The first is please wait till you're called upon. Second, wait for the microphone. Third, use the microphone when you have it. We're recording this, and if you're not using it, we can't hear it for posterity. And finally, please identify yourself when you get the mic. Who would like to start us off? Yep. Actually, is there a microphone coming? Sorry about that. At last.
Steve Lipson, Vanderbilt. I'm wondering how the Ten Commandments played a role in like specific events. Like, was there within all this trying to modernize it or make it more user-friendly? Like, in either the fundamentalist modernist controversy in the 20s or later on, was there an evangelical or fundamentalist opposition to these changes?
Sure.
And also, a second question related to that was, when there was an effort to come up with the Judeo-Christian phrase in the 1950s, was the Ten Commandments did that play an explicit role in that?
Yeah, so let me take the easier question first, which is the second question. Did you all hear that question? I'll recast it slightly. And the question is, I think the question is, to what extent do the Ten Commandments serve as a kind of physical avatar of the Judeo-Christian conceit? I think it does. I think it goes to the very heart, and it's no coincidence that the exact formulation Judeo-Christian heritage emerges in post-war America. It really gets going during the war, but truly emerges as a popular conceit in post-war America, and it's exactly at that time that the DeMille 1956 blockbuster Ten Commandments, which you could still see on television just about any week now, appeared, and also the remarkable effort of an organization known as the Fraternal Order of Eagles, which occupies a lot of real estate in my book, an organization that worked in tandem with DeMille to plant large-scale 6-foot monuments of the Ten Commandments in the public square. And those monuments, which some people rather wittily called DeMille's granite posters for the film, it's those monuments that have landed in the Supreme Court lately. So earlier generations of Americans, for the most part, embraced those as an example of the distinctiveness of America and as a way to render tangible its commitment to the Judeo-Christian heritage. Nowadays, we have a very different take. In terms of your first question, did I come across a kind of evangelical critique of the uses to which the Ten Commandments were put? I did, but I found that the overwhelming thrust of American culture at this time was much more supportive in defense of the idea of the Ten Commandments having a more plastic authority, being much more malleable.
Thank you.
Right up here.
It's coming.
Thanks. That's really so interesting, and it's thought-provoking. And I know I'm going to think of questions after.
You are?
But I know I am Philippa Strum from the Wilson Center, and I'm allowed only one question. So, what you talk about is almost, in a sense, a dumbing down of the Ten Commandments and of religion generally, which is certainly part of American life. But I'm wondering, putting it in the current context, to what extent does this rise and fall as we go throughout American history? To what extent does this happen at tense moments in American history? And to what extent, thinking of your mention of the Supreme Court cases and the Roy Moore kind of thing, to what extent does this become a symbol of something that's not religion at all, but a symbol of this is us, the real Americans, and we're going to make sure that everybody understands that at a moment when people think real American values are being threatened?
Right. Yeah, it's a wonderful question, or a set of questions. I think You'll have to read the book to see the trajectory of all of this. The moments in which the Ten Commandments comes to the fore, not so much as a cornerstone of biblical values, but as American cultural values, can be correlated with crisis moments, moments of tension, when the Ten Commandments are very conveniently trotted out as a pivot around which the country could come together. So I think you're absolutely right. At a moment when the institutions of America seem very fragile, moments of change, massive immigration, a sense that people are no longer adhering so much to biblical values, the public face of the Ten Commandments begins to shine a lot more brightly than it might have at other periods of time. In terms of the dumbing down, this is like the age-old question for historians of the relationship between American culture and religion. Is it a dumbing down, or is it an expansion of its scope, or it's a repositioning? So I guess if you are very devout, as my Vanderbilt friend's question suggests, you would find the appropriation of the Ten Commandments by skincare people and by music and by Paul Anka as rather chilling. But if you see it as an opportunity to insinuate notions of biblical culture and antiquity and perhaps even divine words into the matrix of American life, maybe it's not so ominous, you know? And there's so much work going on right now about the porousness between the sacred and the secular and the ways in which those divisions are so watertight elsewhere but very blurry here. So I'd like to situate my work in that context. So I'm reluctant to say dumbing down because that's a value judgment. I think it's just another way of positioning. And ultimately, I think, and this sounds kind of counterintuitive, the more the Ten Commandments show up, the more the Ten Commandments have a presence and a power, rather than a weakening of that.
Yeah, Alan Crowd, American University. About a week or so ago, David Brooks of the New York Times wrote a piece based on a new book called American Covenant by Goski. And it said that the American narrative is the Exodus narrative. Mm-hmm. That in fact the two are one and the same, and that Americans have really incorporated the Exodus story into the story we tell about ourselves, liberating slaves, valuing freedom in so many different ways. And that Americans' response even to the holiday of Passover suggests a powerful connection, a cultural connection. And I was wondering to what extent your story, your narrative of the Ten Commandments fits into that larger narrative of the book of Exodus and its meaning to Americans.
Absolutely. I think it's just another wrinkle on that. It's another elaboration of that story of the powerful hold that the Exodus and the coming together of a ragtag group of people bound by the force of law, which is the Ten Commandments. I think it's perfectly opposite. And none of what I am saying and none of the 8 years of working on this damn book would have come to fruition had it not been for that fascination that Americans have with this Exodus story, particularly within the context of African American culture, but even transcending that particular expression nationally as well. It's of a piece with America's sense of itself as the promised land, as the heir to the biblical covenant and all of that. So absolutely, it's all about election. I don't mean political election, but being singled out, right? Chosenness, and you know, or maybe you don't, that when the seal of the U.S. was being discussed, several of the founding fathers who ordinarily did not consort well with one another, Jefferson and Franklin, to name two, thought that a scene of Moses just about to lead his people to freedom would be a splendid idea. Of course, they bowed to Mother Nature, and it was an eagle rather than the Exodus. But the fact that that was contemplated at the very formative stages of our nation, and that it was seen as an apt visual expression of who we are as a people in our founding days, underscores, I think, the power of the Ten Commandments and the Exodus story. So yes.
Could I just follow up on that if I could? And I know on one level you can't separate the story of Exodus from the story of the Ten Commandments, but on another level, Well, one could try to make a case that they are of a piece, but they are different. And so the embrace of the story that Alan talked about, so within the African American community, it's not the Ten Commandments that they're excited about. It's the flight from slavery and the entry into a state of freedom. And so they're two different things. And you've got a considerable amount in the book that deal with the movies, the Ten Commandments, and trying to account for kind of the great popularity of those films. But as I read it, I couldn't quite tell if it was the commandments that commanded the audience attention or whether it was the larger Exodus story, of which, okay, there are the scenes, there are the tablets, that's part of it, but it's the Exodus story itself and not the Ten Commandments that hold the fascination of so many people.
Well, we'll just have to differ.
Okay.
I think that the Ten Commandments is the culmination of that story. And all the power of they're being given and then they're being broken and then they're being reformulated and that they go with the people for 40 years as they're marching around aimlessly. I think that it really is the culmination of the story. And there's something about placing one's faith in law, which I think is pretty compelling too. So.
I'll say the funniest moment in the book is when the funniest, I would say there weren't other funny moments, is not just the action figures, but the Mel Brooks scene where Mel Brooks as Moses drops one of the 3 tablets and goes, oops.
Right. Right.
Hi.
Yes.
So Steve Knapp from George Washington. Fantastic material, very, very fascinating
Thank you, sir.
analysis of it. I'm struck by the fact that these days debates about the Ten Commandments, which I remember from some years back, seem to have subsided somewhat and have been replaced by debates about Sharia law. And I wonder how you might reflect on that phenomenon.
It's a wonderful question. We could open it up. I think that in many cases, the debates about the Ten Commandments I wouldn't say so much silenced, but crescendoed with the Supreme Court decision in 2005. And although there are lots of other cases that continue to snake their way up through the court system, the fact that the courts ruled both yes and no about the constitutionality of displaying the Ten Commandments suggests that the issue had sort of been resolved. Now I think as we're living in a very different world than we are in 2005. The question of difference and the fact that in Islamic tradition, the Ten Commandments and Moses, though revered, do not loom as large, suggests another reading. So I have to write a sequel, I guess. But not sure I want to.
Yes. Okay, over there.
Hi, Leslie Laurie, GW. Hi. So my question actually concerns we talked about how the senators in like the 18th, the 19th, and 20th century tried to bring the Ten Commandments into the political sphere of the United States, and similar to what we're experiencing now, that question of is Christianity and the Ten Commandments having a place in the political sphere of America, especially in this day and age when we're so diverse. I just want to know your thoughts on that.
So are you asking me if I think it's a good thing?
No, in that sort of way, how does that fit into their discussions, historically?
Because they feel the Ten Commandments is not just something that happened to the ancient Israelites, which is another interesting dimension. In many cases, there seems to be a kind of collective amnesia that the Ten Commandments were first given to the ancient Israelites, the Jews, and then become other people's property. So the issue of cultural appropriation runs throughout. But I think there's this sense, particularly in the context of these legislators who are seeking to make the Ten Commandments not just an implicit cultural lodestar, but as law, that there's a need to ram home the Christianness of America. So there's something very coercive in those acts. And if you recall, the Alabama senator who is very busy trying to make sure that successive waves of immigrants would pass a test that about the Ten Commandments. He turns out to be, I found out subsequently, an immigration restrictionist. So he really thought that that would keep them away. Little did he know that the people who were coming into these shores were those who were perhaps most conversant with the Ten Commandments. There's a lot to be said about the coercive nature, which is why these cases landed in front of the Supreme Court, and that's part of the story. The other part of the story is the less coercive aspects, where it's not about rigidly defining America as a Christian culture in which some are in and some are out, but the diffusion of biblical values more generally. So that's what I was trying to get out there.
I wonder, Professor Joselit, if you could, for a second, talk about the Supreme Court case, since you mentioned it a couple of times. Not everybody is perhaps familiar with it.
For many years, particularly since the 50s and the 60s, the Fraternal Order of Eagles, which is a very reputable fraternal group of, up until recently, largely all white men, did good works and felt that the Ten Commandments needed to be heralded much more forthrightly. And one of their members came up with a campaign which he thought was a kind of response to juvenile delinquency in the 50s, and that if more courts and more kids would see the Ten Commandments, it would act as a prophylactic. It was act as a deterrent. Okay, that's like the preamble to the story. So he's a member of the Fraternal Order of Eagles. He gets them to sign on to this campaign. They distribute thousands of paper versions of the Ten Commandments, which the Fraternal Eagles themselves had I don't know what the right word is, arranged. The Fraternal Order of Eagles called on a trio, this just sounds like a joke, but it's not, of a rabbi, a priest, and a minister from each tradition. No, they didn't walk into a bar. He asked them to sit down and to come up with a version of the Ten Commandments, which was consensual. Now, this also requires going back in time because, as you may or may not know, there are different versions of the Ten Commandments, not so much in terms literally of the text, but in terms of the numbering. So, for example, the Jews believe the first commandment, I am the Lord thy God, is the first commandment. Protestants think it's a preamble. Lovely, they don't toss it out, but it's the kind of sets things in motion. It's not the first. So, in order to come up with what they called a non-denominational version of the Ten Commandments, this trio got together, they hammered things out, and you'll notice if you look very carefully, there are no numbers on the, like when I showed that slide, where's Peter? Oh, too late to get back up. See if I could find it for you. Somewhere? Getting there. Okay, if you notice, so first there were paper scrolls, and then under the impress of DeMille's movie, and with a heightened sense that, gee, this was really important, particularly as the Soviet Union is rearing its head, the Fraternal Order of Eagles raised enough money, found a quarry in Minnesota whose granite they thought most resembled that of Mount Sinai, and built, commissioned, and planted hundreds of these in civic squares around the country. This is the one in Austin, Texas. And there it stood for, I don't know, 40-odd years, kind of just there. And it was part of, it's on the state capitol grounds, and it's one of 17 other statuaries, sculptures that reflect one or another aspect of Texas history. So there was a gentleman named Van Orden, again, I can't make this up even if I tried, who was a homeless lawyer who had been disbarred, who would cool his heels in the Texas Law Library. And every day he'd walk past this thing, and it really bothered him because he thought that it had no business being on, it's a statement of religion. It's not one of those culturally affirming loose things. It really is the text of the Ten Commandments. So he took it to court, and he got the ACLU and the American Jewish Congress involved. And this thing, over time, made its way through the Supreme Court so that the justices would have an opportunity to decide whether it was constitutional or not for this to be displayed on public property, state grounds. At the same time, there's a district in Kentucky where much later than this, so this, let's say, is immediate post-war, the folks in Kentucky decided to put up a display about documents that are essential to American culture, and they put up the Ten Commandments. And at the dedication of this Ten Commandments, and it was a paper thing with a a gilded frame, a pastor officiated at the ceremony. And this got all the way to the local branch of the ACLU. It said, you can't do that. So they put up something else, the Star-Spangled Banner, and they put up a picture of Lady Justice, and they thought, see, it's American. And they said, no, you can't do this. And ultimately, this case, not this one, the Kentucky case, landed in the Supreme Court, and the justices decided to conjoin them. And what they ruled was that this was okay, this Texas one was fine, but that the Kentucky one wasn't fine. I forget who said it, it's in the book someplace, but one of the justices said, you know, we have to look Janus-like at these issues, which I thought was a very smart way of reckoning with it. That on one hand, there's history and there's American culture. On the other hand, there's the presence. And so they ruled yes and no. They ruled that this is okay, this one is okay, because it speaks to history, it speaks to museology, because perhaps you can conjure up the Texas State Grounds as a kind of outdoor sculpture garden. But the Kentucky one clearly was done with the intent of using a state building to promote religion. So it was a violation of the Establishment Clause. So that's the long and the short of it. It's bedeviled the legal community because they want a straightforward answer, yes or no, it's constitutional or not constitutional. But I think the more I mull over this, the Supremes were right in this one decision, because it takes into account the primacy of history and the ways in which the Ten Commandments are seen as part of our national patrimony. It's also relevant to the writing of the book. I got the idea for the writing of the book when I saw a photograph of beshorted American men with large stomachs, carrying around papier-mâché cardboard versions of the Ten Commandments, circling the Supreme Court. And I said to myself, there's something here between the shorts and the passion and the pilgrimage and the fact that they're rendered out of cardboard. There's got to be a story here. So hopefully I'm right.
Thank you. Yeah, gentleman over here.
David Sobelson, Washington, D.C. What have those who've promoted the establishment of these granite objects in public spaces, what have they done? How have they dealt with the first few commandments, and particularly the obviously political one that says that other gods should be rejected? And what have they said about religions that worship those other gods, that have other gods before the me of the commandments?
They don't. They just stick with the biblical text, and to the extent that they're mindful of the larger controversy, they respond to that by not numbering these. So you see there are no numbers, and there are all these other little elements. You should come up close and take a look later. So they don't engage with other issues, and they don't have any sense whatsoever that this might be infringing on First Amendment. I think this is just a swell idea because this is what makes America great, and also, you know, it's what defines us in opposition to the godless Soviet Union. So I wouldn't say there's a huge amount of intellection that's accompanying this. It's a kind of public gesture that reaffirms solidly the importance of the Ten Commandments and the biblical tradition. And there's also something about the scale of it. You can't miss them. In fact, there's this great quote where somebody says, you know, you can see what this is even in rain or shine. You know, I mean, the round-toppedness, the volume, the scale. And I think it's a way to, particularly in the context of the 50s, to project mightily in the public square how Americans are different and proud of it.
In a way, the politics really reflect...
Microphone. Yeah. Thou shalt use the microphone.
Thank you. In a way, the politics of erecting these objects reflects the politics of the original commandments as a way of distinguishing a people from other people, right, and saying that this is our people and not the other people like Hindus or Buddhists.
Yeah, and that's why it's so controversial today, because, and those people who are so gung-ho about making sure that the Ten Commandments are bright and shiny and strong and everywhere, are actually making a statement about change and trying to hold at bay change. And that's why they got to go.
Thank you. Yep.
Ben Jacobs, GW. This is not a plant, though. So I wonder if you found evidence, and I understand fully the Americanization story, so this will sound a little bit parochial, but you address this subtly in your discussion of the Seder and the action figure. Did you find evidence of the commercialization of these items perhaps as a way of pandering to a perceived affluent Jewish community that might buy into some of this stuff? I mean, and I ask also because even in this image here, what are those Stars of David doing so prominently on this image? Was that maybe if we slap those on there, they won't say anything type of thing? And I'm not...
I see where you're going.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So this requires a bit of a long-winded answer, so I hope you'll bear with. The people who are not so thrilled about these large-scale monuments, and the people who, well before Mr. Van Orden, took great exception in the courts to them, was the Jewish community. And I found marvelous behind-the-scenes material where the Jewish community is trying to dissuade the Fraternal Order of Eagles from doing this and coming up with very clever arguments and saying that it's bad for religion when these things become, as you said before, kind of denuded or lesser lights. And it's bad for religion. And they actually have a marvelous legal brief where they say that the Ten Commandments are not a bit of sociology. They're not a platform for right living. You know, they're divine laws, and so it behooves America just to keep religion over there and keep Civic Square. So I would say that the Moses action figures are of a different order than these Ten Commandments things because for the Jews there was something very uncomfortable. Even though the Ten Commandments grows out of Jewish history, something very uncomfortable about putting them in the public square. But the doll is of a different order. I think the doll underscores a kind of playfulness and effort to make Jewishness more lively than ceremonial. So I don't know if I'm persuasive or not, but I would disentangle the two. Can we all recite the Ten Commandments?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all the way back there.
Thank you, Adrian Stefan. Did you find any of this fixation with the Ten Commandments prior to the Civil War? I mean, how was it relevant in the 18th and early 19th centuries?
Sure. So the question is, does this fascination with the Ten Commandments predate the Civil War? Yeah. What intrigued me about the post-Civil War, and this is not an artful dodge, I'll get to your question, is that they become the stuff of public conversation and sometimes discord. Or as one of my beautiful sources from 1876 says, it's really important to give the Ten Commandments an airing and a ventilation, which is exactly what we're doing. Before, I think they were more tacitly part of the body politic for Americans at large. I did not see any instances of controversy or discomfort. They were just, nor were they trotted out in quite the same way. And this goes to your question, so there's a lot of symmetry going on here, that at moments of crisis, they are deployed much more actively than they had before.
Yes.
Michael.
Michael Kimmage, Catholic University. I'm curious about competitors.
Step in a little bit so we can all see you.
Oh, sure. Curious about competitors to the Ten Commandments in American culture, and the one that comes most easily to mind would be the U.S. Constitution. And so I'm wondering if either in the book or your research you came across dialogue between the two. You know, perhaps they went up to Philadelphia and came down with the Constitution, you know, sort of an echoing of that pattern from that end, or sort of potentially competition between the two, because after all, the Constitution mandates a number of things that does make the Ten Commandments a kind of awkward civic presence in American life.
So the short answer, Michael, is no. And I didn't see that, but then I wasn't, you know, as a historian that you find what you're looking for. So I wasn't looking at the Constitution, and it didn't pop up in the 2 zillion sources that I that I looked at, except when it came to contravening the Constitution. That's when it reared its head in really big ways. I should say, too, that this was an extraordinarily daunting project. The amount of literature on the Ten Commandments, rhetorical, sermonic, midrashic, you can drown in this stuff, and I think for a very long time I did drown in this stuff, and it took forever till I figured out what my trajectory was and what the intellectual burden of the story was. So I'm sure that there are lots of other ways to conceptualize the project, but what really interested me was the insinuation of the Ten Commandments into American culture in all of its manifestations. Shall we leave it there?
Just have one question that I would like to add, and you have a great line at the end of the book about the takeaway. And so why all the hullabaloo about the Ten Commandments, why their importance throughout much of American history. And the punchline that you offer quite succinctly is that they provide Americans with a pedigree. And if the old world has its royalty and its coat of arms and its castles, we have the Ten Commandments here in the New World, and that heightens a sense of election, of the specialness of Americans. And so maybe if you could just share some of the examples from the book that highlight that, A, and B, if you could talk about, as a cultural historian, how you can does that apply across time? Is this something that your 19th century religious figures are expressing? Is this what the the Eagles are expressing? Is this what our conservative judge is expressing?
What's the what?
The sense of pedigree, the sense of the differentiation of old world and new.
Okay, so that's my take on it. I absorbed and immersed myself in lots and lots of different sources, listened to different voices, calibrated the different voices, and at the end of the day had to come up with something. Did they use the word pedigree? No, but when I stop and think about comparisons between the U.S. and other countries where none of this, not even in the state of Israel, none of this takes place, it occurred to me that there's something, I don't use this word, but maybe I ought to have, magical or provocative, really powerful about the allure of the Ten Commandments. And so when I pulled back after looking at all these sources and tried to think, okay, what is that? It occurred to me that it offers America as a nation something that maybe the Constitution, but this has a kind of force that no other religious documents and living traditions has. And so putting it all together, digesting, distilling, it occurred to me, what is that thing? It's a pedigree. Now, I could be all wet, but it's my interpretation. So.
We have one more question right here.
Oh, come on.
Thank you very much. Benjamin Tua, no current affiliation. I have a request for a little clarification and a question. And on the Stars of David, on that monument, wouldn't it simply be an acknowledgement of the Hebrew origins, the Jewish origins of the commandments? And, I mean, there's no cross on there, for example.
There's a Cairo, is there? I mean, it's a blurry image. There's every conceivable, this thing is so visually busy.
All right, so it does, okay.
Yeah.
And my question is on the relationship between decorum and these various symbols and so on of the representations of the Ten Commandments and religion in times of in times of stress. Mm-hmm. Would you comment on the musical Jesus Christ Superstar and how that fit into the environment at the time, and anything else that you might have
Could
to
I
say.
talk about the two Ten Commandments films? Because I'm not familiar with Jesus Christ Superstar or Joseph. What was the other musical? Joseph and his
Multicolored Technicolor coat.
There's something in popular culture that takes hold of these religious concepts and runs with it, and then implants it within the popular arena. There's a very, I wouldn't say distinguished, but a very defined tradition in American popular culture of doing just that. So Jesus Christ Superstar is an example. DeMille made not one but two films about the Ten Commandments, one in 1923, one in 1956, which were enormously popular, not just because of their cinematic bravado and daring do, but because I think that they offer a kind of affirmation, a lifting of the spirit. And musicals and movies are able to do that in ways that sermons often are not, and I think that goes to the heart of it.
I asked my question because I think at the time a lot of people were offended that they would refer to Jesus in this way, and with the, the motorcycles and all the, at the time, outrageous behavior.
All righty. Next book.
All right, we'll make this the final question then.
This is just a brief comment that, piggybacking on the gentleman's comment about the other images such as the Constitution. From what you've said, it seems to me that this linking that it makes us special connected to the Ten Commandments is partly because, perhaps, they were handed down by God. So unlike the Constitution written by man, the U.S. is, I probably shouldn't take it too far to say that we are God ordained, but is this piece that it's God-like connection something?
That's very good. There's something about the Ten Commandments that they're the Word of God. They're handed down through a man. They're designed for people to live by. They're an object, but they're also words. They're celestial, but they're also something else. I think the fluidity of the Ten Commandments from the very get-go is part of their appeal, and that lends itself to so many different iterations. They are cast in stone, but there's something about the stone that still is porous and permeable, and that cries out for interpretation. And that's what I tried to do. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Joselit, for a really enriching late afternoon. Thank you all for your comments and questions. We'll invite you to a very simple reception outside, some wine, some snacks. Please be reminded next week, Michael Kazin on the war against war, the rise, defeat, and legacy of the peace movement in America. Thank you so much. And again, thanks, Professor Joselit.
Thank you so much.
Good questions.
Good. I hope it was fun.
Thank you.